Hi, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this is another edition of Friends and Enemies. With me in Germany is Alex Benesch. We discuss the issues of the day in terms of the friend-enemy distinction, the emerging wars, and war that is coming, it appears. And I just wanted to start out with a quote from this guy. This is New Lies for Old. And oops, turned it the wrong way. New Lies for Old by Anatoly Golitsyn. It was written in 1984. He was a KGB defector, and he predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Blocs, the Warsaw Pact, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Communist Party giving up its power voluntarily, by the way, in the Soviet Union, and saying that it would all be part of a fraud, a false liberalization. He wrote this before Gorbachev came to power. He said there would be a new Soviet leader who would be a liberalizer. There were like 148 falsifiable predictions in this book, according to Mark Riebling. And by 1993-94, almost 94% of those predictions had come true. There's an additional prediction in this book that's come true now, talking about the Sino-Soviet split, which he said was also a deception operation. A very controversial statement, which most experts absolutely violently disagree with, but which I believe is proving true. He said that after the successful use of the scissors strategy in the early stages of the final phase of policy to assist communist strategy in Europe and the Third World and over disarmament, a Sino-Soviet reconciliation could be expected. Now that has happened. It is contemplated and implied by the long-range policy and by strategic disinformation on the split. This guy Golitsyn was a very talented analyst. He also worked with James Angleton and the counterintelligence staff, who are now under assault, by the way, in these supposed interpretation of these new JFK documents. You'll hear these experts, and they gratuitously try to explain how these documents show that James Angleton and his counterintelligence staff, the people that were with Golitsyn, were somehow behind Kennedy's death. They're trying to slander these people in retrospect. It's very interesting. And you'll notice the pro-Russian tendencies of the people attempting to advance the JFK conspiracy theory now. Anyway, it continues. The communist bloc, in this future time of Sino-Soviet reconciliation, with its recent accretions in Africa and Southeast Asia, is already strong. European-backed Soviet influence and American-backed Chinese influence could lead to new third world acquisitions, and it has, at an accelerating pace. Note General Laura Richardson, commander of Southern Command, saying that China and Russia were moving in and taking over Latin America in the Western Hemisphere. He says, before long, the communist strategist might be persuaded that the balance had swung irreversibly in their favor. In that event, they might well decide on a Sino-Soviet reconciliation. The scissors strategy would give way to a strategy of one clenched fist. At that point, the shift in the political and military balance would be plain for all to see. Convergence would not be between two equal partners, but would be on terms dictated by the communist bloc. Now, this is what we are actually seeing today as Trump claims we have to avoid a nuclear war. Russia's too strong. And Trump actually plays a weak hand, saying we have to surrender Ukraine, we have to get out of NATO, we have to have Greenland, and we have to have an agreement with Vladimir Putin. We have to be friends. There we go from conflict with Russia to convergence, where Trump is converging America with Russia and basically letting Ukraine and NATO fall under Russian control. That is what we're seeing. And I just wondered, Alex, we had Vice President Vance's trip to Greenland and the chaos it caused. I had two conversations to two influential Canadians in the Conservative Party, one of who is close to the prospective conservative candidate for the premiership. We've got Canadian elections coming. We've got a new Canadian prime minister on the left in the Liberal Party, Mr. Carney, and they think he's going to lose. I mean, they think Carney's going to win and the right is going to lose. And this is all due to Trump's attempt to grab Canada. And of course, he's trying to grab Greenland. This mystifies everyone. Canada and Greenland are allies of the United States, part of NATO, and we already have basing rights in Greenland, for example, where we can already position defensive forces. We don't need sovereignty over Greenland to do it.
But
so
isn't it like
what do you
image?
say about this, Alex?
Isn't it like a couldn't this be like almost a mirror image? No, we're looking at the Trump administration and their strange media publicity strategy, alienating people everywhere in the world, and there's a serious danger of betrayal. There's a serious danger of, as you've explained so well on this show and other shows, the danger of settling. This idea that the Trump administration and related powerful circles in the West, they have sort of they will settle with the Russians and they will settle with the Chinese, but ultimately we're going to lose in that settlement. So that's one way to see it. That there's this looming betrayal, that there's the Trump admin is destroying things. But if we place ourselves or we try to place ourselves into the minds of the Trump admin and certain people in the Trump admin, it must have looked like to them as if, for example, Europe did the betraying and the settling with we Europeans. We Europeans, we try to settle with the Chinese and settle with the Russians, and we didn't spend any serious money on defense, and we let our armies rot. And we know about Canada, we know about the Trudeau era, and we know about Greenland attached to Denmark, and Denmark is part of Europe, and they didn't take defense seriously. So I think that from, let's say, high-ranking Pentagon people and high-ranking strategists and high-ranking intelligence people in America, from this American or this particular American perspective, looking at Europe, looking at Canada, looking at Greenland, it looks like those guys are the traitors, right? And it's like, when you talk about that fake split, and I think we did an entire episode or maybe more than one episode specifically focused on that fake split between Russia and China. They're like one thing ultimately. But aren't the communists full of themselves? Aren't they maybe a bit too confident about them? Because let's see what they did after 1991. They did what was predicted by Golitsyn and others. They did all these kind of steps, but at the same time they picked Vladimir Putin for that public position. He's been in office since 1999 or something, and we know about Putin. Putin being handpicked among other KGB guys, handpicked by these older KGB guys like Andropov, and we've heard statements from Putin about Andropov, and he wants to have the statues refurbished of these KGB legends and the Lubyanka and all that nonsense, and they picked Putin. They could have picked a guy who seemed less obvious, less suspicious, and the Chinese communists, they stuck to their Maoist thing. They kind of did fake capitalism over there, where the Communist Party now has these fake billionaires, and they trade globally, especially with Europe. It seems so risky from my perspective, what the Russians did and the Chinese did. They had all this planned out. They had all this fake split, and they had all this step-by-step program.
They did a maneuver. They did a maneuver according to Golitsyn, and I think Golitsyn nailed it, because he predicted what happened, and he said why it happened. And as Mark Riebling pointed out, all these people in the establishment that got it wrong wanted to attack him, And of course, I think Russian active measures attacked him. You've got the book Cold Warrior that attacked him, and other books that attacked Golitsyn and Angleton. But here we see this strategy succeeding. Just give it time. I talked to a KGB officer many years ago who was privy to a lot of this, who told me that he had actually met with the head of the first chief directorate of the KGB after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and after 1991, after they took down the statue of Dzerzhinsky, after the what they call the August coup. And he actually asked Shabarshin, KGB general, have we lost? Is our cause lost? And Shabarshin told him, well, we took some unexpected hits. It didn't work out perfectly, but it really is on track. And we have high hopes for it, and that we can repair the damage that's been done. But we've basically deceived the West. And then he proceeded to ask him about the banks in Central Europe that the KGB controlled, and could they move KGB and party money through those banks to acquire assets in the West, now that the West was psychologically disarmed. And so they were proceeding with their deception. We know this. I know this from other sources too, that in my own investigation to see if Golitsyn is valid. And just within hours ago, General Hodges, a former NATO commander, interviewed by Times Radio, made, and I'll try to paraphrase him. He said the way that the Trump administration is reorganizing the Pentagon, the United States Army is going to have a decline of 30% in manpower. That to him, it's clear that they are shrinking the U.S. military. They're not expanding it. At the same time, they are angering our NATO allies. They're threatening the sovereignty of Denmark in Greenland, and they are threatening Canada with annexation. And Trump is saying, our beautiful 51st state, Canada, you better give in. And he's raising, first it's 20% tariffs, and then it's like on some things it's like 200%. I mean, he's going after these countries, and he's going after Europe. He's got only his tariffs on China are nothing compared to what he's doing to our NATO allies. He's trying to destroy them, and this is not. And General Hodges is hopeful that this policy will be corrected. But you see Vance in Greenland. And I want to play, let's listen to what, do we have time? I could play what Vance said in Greenland.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I think it's important to hear Vance's words. And before I do this, Golitsyn had something to say about this idea of splitting Europe from America, because Europe's form of democracy, social democracy, is different than America's, although it's not too much now. America's got quite a bit of social democracy too. And this is what Golitsyn had to say. He called it ideological solidarity under Where Now? And he said, differences between American conservatives and European social democrats in their attitudes towards capitalism should not be allowed to weaken the Atlantic alliance. And that's basically what I heard a Trump advisor tell me almost 3 weeks ago, was that Europe is communist. We don't want anything to do with it. Russia is the ally for us. And somehow they have identified social democratic Europe with communism. And here Golitsyn goes on to warn, its economic ideals show some common features with the communist system and differ markedly from American economic ideals, but like Americans, European social democrats regard democratic freedom as sacrosanct when faced by communists. The two are natural allies. They joined together when faced by Stalin's police socialism. Now they must join forces again to face the more insidious deception of communism with a human face. In the case of Vladimir Putin, he's supposedly a Christian, right? And he's democratically elected, supposedly, and he's a conservative, right? And he's religious. Their common interest is overwhelming, for both Europe and America are targets of a political offensive that seeks to embrace them now only to strangle them later. And Golitsyn is almost absolutely positively correct on this. And then now let's listen to, and of course you heard what Vance said in Europe. You heard this anti-NATO rhetoric that was coming out. You saw the treatment of Zelensky in the Oval Office meeting, and of course these things are there's something seriously wrong with this.
Yeah,
so
but
here is Vance.
Yeah, let's play that clip.
Wait a minute. Let me get that to the beginning here.
This territory, Greenland, really matters for the security of the United States. It's extremely vulnerable right now. And if the people of Greenland were willing to partner with the United States, and I think that they ultimately will partner with the United States, we could make them much more secure. We could do a lot more protection. And I think they'd fare a lot better economically as well. This has to happen. And the reason it has to happen, I hate to say it, is because our friends in Denmark have not done their job in keeping this area safe. They just haven't done it. It's very simple. For all of our friends in the American media who attack the administration for pointing out the obvious, what is the alternative? To give up the North Atlantic, to give up the Arctic to China, to Russia, and to other the American people at heart? We have no other option. We need to take a significant position in Greenland to keep the people here safe, but to keep our own country safe too.
I mean, this is foul. This is foul, and I'll tell you why. Greenland is a tiny country. Its military capability is very small, and America's always had bases in Greenland, and we have basing rights there. We're building bases there now. And so we have to have sovereignty over it. Our NATO treaty is we have bases in these countries provided that we respect their sovereignty. Why do we need to annex Greenland? This enrages Europe. It creates a rift, and it is not necessary for security. The whole Cold War, we didn't have sovereignty over Greenland, but we had bases. Why is this an issue now? This doesn't make any sense. He's lying in terms of the fact that, Denmark couldn't protect it. We need to. I mean, that's a foul argument. Denmark can't protect it. We need to own it. Not that we're our ally and it's good for us to have a base there.
Well, I mean,
which we've had.
Well,
right?
Europe. I mean, Europe is a strange place because there's so many countries with crazy histories and global ambitions, right? So, just to draw a comparison, when what was it? It wasn't the Netherlands. It was Belgium. Belgium, I think it was. Tiny little kingdom, related to all of British Empire and some of these other families and entities. And a while ago, this tiny little country, Belgium, they said, we have this idea, we're going to take over the Congo in Africa. And people said, okay, where's the Congo again? Oh, it seems fairly large, right? I mean, it seems like a stupid idea. And then they had this Congress in Europe where Belgium again pitched this idea and said, if you let us do this, if you don't interfere, it's going to be awesome, right? So these other countries looked at this plan and said, this sounds stupid, so you just go ahead, little Belgium, and you see what you can do. So what the Belgians did was they equipped a few thousand men, professional soldiers, with modern firearms, deployed them to Congo, and they took it over. And this became a complete horror show. But it showed that that weird European ambition and this sense of entitlement, that we can see there's an area and we're going to exploit it and we're going to just shoot these people that have no idea about what we're capable of. There are modern weapons. And of course the Congo, they had like 400 languages there. So you go a few kilometers in that direction, people spoke a different language. These people in Congo were not organized, so this is how it was taken over. And I'm making this comparison because Europe has this history of insane ambitions and actually just dominating and completely harshly exploiting some of these territories. Now, when people look at a map that is where the North Pole is in the center, I think that helps a lot for people to understand this. The North Pole is in the center. to the left is Russia, very close. To the right, immediately comes
Can you
Canada.
show the map
Um,
to the audience?
maybe I'll just put the link in. Put the link here, and then just so people can. So people can actually
it'd be good to see it.
Yeah, so people can actually see what I
And understand that the Arctic is a kind of battleground between NATO and Russia. The NATO and Russian countries basically are all that abuts the Arctic. Every country that's up against the Arctic now is either a NATO country or a Russia.
Here's that map right in the dead center. You have the North Pole, the Arctic Ocean, and right to the left is Mother Russia. Scary, isn't it? Mm-hmm. What a long.
Well, they've got half the Arctic just about on their coastline. Yeah.
Look at the coastline. I mean, of course they have a problem with frozen ports and all that. That's why they want to get into
11
Europe.
time zones, by the way. 11 time zones. So you'll notice that the Russian coastline is more developed because it's a little farther south in terms of temperature. It's not as some of these ports are ice-free part of the summer, whereas the Northwest Passage is not really usable on the Canadian side. There's these archipelagos, and the ice clings to them more readily. Yeah. And so that's one of the reasons. And you see Greenland there, this large land mass, glaciated land mass there. And you can see Nuuk, and of course Iceland's also strategically located as well. And the openings, you'll notice the openings to the Atlantic. The Russian fleet is based at Murmansk, the northern fleet, the biggest fleet. It's bigger than all of Russia's other fleets put together. It's based in Murmansk there, within the Arctic Circle. You can see it there near Finland. You'll see that is a huge naval and air concentration of force there. And that port is really, in recent decades, is rarely iced over. Large submarines, the Peter the Great, the Russians, they sometimes call it a battleship. It's a cruiser. It's a missile cruiser, are based there. Nuclear capable warships. They have been loading, by the way, the Russians have been loading on their Kursk class. These are
submarines.
14,000 ton submarines. They're like submersible heavy cruisers. They carry surface to surface missiles, torpedoes. Some think maybe supercavitating torpedoes, and of course cruise missiles. And that can be nuclear capable. This would be a nuclear battleship, really. The Kursk, which can surface and devastate the East Coast, devastate a fleet or battle group. It's a tremendous weapon, and they're loading them with nuclear weapons right now.
Yeah, so right there, this is what you've been talking about, Murmansk, and then you have Finland, Sweden, and Norway. This is Denmark. This is Denmark and Copenhagen, and very, very close to it is Germany. So this is actually so it's supposed to be up there. I mean, it's on this map. It's around here where my mouse cursor is. That's about where Germany is. Very, very close. Scary close, by the way. So then you got this part here. And down there is Alaska. Now that was once under Tsarist Russian possession, but they couldn't make use of it. They didn't have the money and the capability to really make use of it, so they sold it. And now the Russians are disputing that sale and saying, we don't accept that and we want it back.
Yeah, it was 1867, I believe. Though Secretary of State William Seward arranged the purchase of Alaska from Russia, and it is American sovereign territory. It is the people who live there are Americans, and there has never been any issue raised about the buying of Alaska being a lease. We're only letting you have it temporarily. The Russians are claiming it now. The Duma has even passed laws for how to govern it once they've taken it back. This is rather bold,
Yeah.
but it goes to intention.
And then right next here to Alaska is Canada, which formally Canada is still run by the British king. That's a whole nother story. So there's like this conservative backstory to Canada, but we all remember the Trudeau era and how crazy that was, and also Canada leaning towards China, and China would be around somewhere around below this map. So this is a different perspective. This is the North Pole in the center. So this is Russia, and then of course at some point on the map you will actually reach China. So people can imagine if a sizable force would claim the Arctic, this communist force could take over Greenland and Alaska, or go into Alaska, or go into Canada first, and then move further and further. And of course, ideally for the communists, it would be a pincer attack. So you would try to push into the United States, and then you would have some uprisings in Mexico and some angry Latinos pushing into the United States, and of course illegal Latinos in the United States rebelling, torching cities, and putting things on fire. That's kind of like your basic pincer strategy that the communists would like to implement. And so
The Chinese, by the way, are all over Canada, and they've
Yeah.
infiltrated Mexico.
Oh yeah.
And I've talked about
And
the Sidewinder report from Canada, and also Scott Gulbranson's work on
Yeah.
Chinese infiltration of Mexico. These are a process that's been going on for
Yeah.
almost 30 years.
And I think
Yeah.
Vance has entered a whole new world. He has a new security clearance, and he gets briefed, and he's sensing how dramatic things are, and then he goes and talks to the public, and it's not there's not enough of a filter there. I mean, he's kind of breaking it down for the public. He's not giving away classified info, but it seems like it's easy to misunderstand, and the New York Times is certainly trying to misunderstand it or interpret it in a standard leftist way. And of course, we have to worry about what Vance is really playing at, what Trump is really playing, what others in the administration are really playing at. It would be much, much, much better if they had a clear media strategy where we can deduct that they have a military strategy, that they have a diplomatic strategy, that they have a strategy to, bring in the allies and have like a proper
They're totally incompetent. Bringing in the allies, they're kicking the allies from behind,
but
they're not bringing them in.
As I said, from their perspective, from the Trump admin's perspective, they may see the Canadians as the traitors. They may see the Europeans as the traitors. Who
the Europeans and the Canadians are with us as long as we're not joining Russia against them. And Putin flew to Murmansk not long ago, and he gave a talk. He gave a speech up there in which he laid into Britain, but he made some points in his speech which are I should remark. They're rather striking comments about Ukraine and about the competition with NATO. This is what he said. He said that Russia did not. He told the sailors Russia did not, which is of course a lie. They did. He said there was a coup in.
Could you repeat that last bit, because there was an interruption in the connection?
Sorry, Putin's remark. He said we did not start this war, the war in Ukraine, which is a lie. They started it. They're the invader. The invader starts the war. The country being invaded is not the one that starts the war. And then he said. Then he went on to justify, saying there was a coup in 2014. Conducted by various Western, it's strange how he put it, various Western countries. Well, coups aren't performed by various countries.
I bet James Angleton rose from his grave and started the Maidan Revolution to harm Mother Russia.
It's crazy. It's literally crazy. And then, of course, he said, well, we were patient for 8 years, but but Ukraine was genociding the East, which, of course, these are all false claims. They weren't patient. They annexed Crimea. They invaded the Donbass, which were illegal. Ukraine's sovereignty was not only guaranteed by the Soviet Union itself breaking up and Moscow recognizing Ukraine's borders back in the early 90s, but it was also double guaranteed by the Budapest Memorandum to the Nuclear Proliferation Agreement. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for Russia saying, yes, we will guarantee your borders and your sovereignty. Well, they didn't. They invaded in 2014 both Donbass and annexed Crimea. And of course, Putin calls this patience. And of course, he blames a genocide, which is completely crazy.
I mean,
these lies, by the way, yeah.
Isn't Putin kind of genociding a bunch of Russians through this war?
Genociding Ukraine. He's genociding Ukraine.
Yeah, but he's also kind of Putin is also kind of genociding Russians who are seen as less valuable Russians, because those were the ones being drafted into the Ukraine war and shredded on the battlefield, and they come home in a body bag.
He's taking Asian, he's taking Muslim Russians, and he's favoring them as cannon fodder in the fight. Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
But he said then he lies. Additionally, he said that we had an agreement in 2022 with Ukraine, which the UK destroyed. And he's referring to the agreement made in Turkey. I think it was made in was it Istanbul that they made this agreement, supposedly, but it was not real. And it was Boris Johnson who said, look, don't sign this agreement. We will back you, because that agreement would have compromised Ukraine's sovereignty. And this is a quote of what Putin said. I think the new U.S. president wants to end the conflict, said Putin. We want peace, but we must address the root causes. We must secure Russia for the long term. The crux of the issue is the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev, which, again, that's crazy. There is no neo-Nazi regime in Kiev.
Yeah, all white people
again,
are
another
neo-Nazis
war
to the
propaganda
Russians.
lie. Yeah.
Yeah, all white people are neo-Nazis or Nazis to the Russians. I mean, goes back to the legend of Alexander Nevsky defending Mother Russia against the Swedes and the these Germans, these Teutonic Knights, and then you saw the Soviet propaganda movies. Like the movie, this movie's called, I think, Alexander Nevsky, and they show these white devil blonde troopers invading Mother Russia, and then Saint Alexander Nevsky is defending the motherland, Mother Russia, against these white devils. I mean, it's like when we see, let's just check for a second what the New York Times has to say about this. Of course, about Vance visiting Greenland. The subheadline says, the trip was both a reconnaissance mission and a passive-aggressive reminder of President Trump's determination to fulfill his territorial ambitions no matter the obstacles. Oh, there we go. It's a conservative world conspiracy again. And to me, it's almost like what anti-Semitism is to the extreme right wing. The left, the socialists. The left has this idea of a conservative world conspiracy, and it's everywhere. It has to be fought on every level, down to how we raise children in the school system and everything, because we just, they want to just root out this conservative conspiracy once and for all. You can't live with conservatives; they all have to disappear, have to be converted. And I mean, of course, if Vance is not picking his words better, if others in the administration are not having a coherent media strategy, I mean, they say one thing, then they say the other thing. There was a video posted on social media. This was from Donald J. Trump, and it's like this, and it's like this 1 minute 30-second. Almost like a historical highlight reel about Greenland, and it's about how the Nazis wanted to, how the Nazis, they wanted to get into Greenland. You know, the fascists wanted to get into Greenland and then move on from there. They show an old Universal newsreel with the headline "U.S. to guard Greenland." So this is kind of a historical parallel. I mean, why didn't Vance make this historical parallel and say, the U.S. once was defending Greenland. It's not that we want to desperately have it. We just don't want to lose it to the enemy. And if people look at this, map, right? Here's Greenland, and next to it is a Norwegian island called Svalbard. This was also a target for the Nazis, and they wanted to have it for different purposes and future purposes. And also, there was the Svalbard island and some other islands. Those were strategic targets for the Nazis because they wanted to have the Nazis wanted to have the weather stations in order to predict the weather more accurately for the German armed forces, and to see what the weather was, to predict what the Allies would do in terms of warfare, because it all depended on the weather. It all depended on the waves and the clouds, and I mean even the D-Day invasion. I mean, if people look on this map, there's Europe, there's Denmark, and this is the coastline, of course. This is the coastline, and a bit to the a bit further on top, above this map, you will actually find the spot, one of the main spots where the D-Day invasion actually happened, and we know that D-Day could only happen because of very accurate weather reports, done by the British, done by the Americans. And there was this legendary Captain James Stagg, and he said that we need to postpone the D-Day invasion to the next day. We have to postpone it by one day. And he convinced Eisenhower, and then they postponed it, and it worked. If they hadn't predicted the weather as accurately, D-Day wouldn't have happened. And so that's why the Nazis wanted Svalbard Island. They wanted some other islands to get more weather information. So I mean, you could have picked a much better media strategy. I mean, if we assume for a moment, just an assumption, if we assume for a moment that Vance has that Vance truly wants to push back against Russia, push back against China. And he understands, because of the briefing and a security clearance, that the Arctic is a potential battlefield. If we assume he means well, Mr. Vance, why didn't he pick a better media strategy? Because the left is having a field day. See, the New York Times. The New York Times is saying the trip was a reconnaissance mission and a reminder of Trump's determination to fulfill his territorial ambitions. I mean, we know what the Times is thinking, and and they quote this bit: "We have to have Greenland. It's not a question of do you think we can do it without it. We can't." This was a Trump quote, they say, in fact, of the 4 territories Mr. Trump has discussed acquiring, Greenland, the Panama Canal, Canada, and Gaza, it is Greenland that he seems most determined to get, as if he wants to own it, as if he wants to, maybe he wants to raise his flag and say, this is Trump Island now. I mean, but still, I mean, it's a strategic battleground, and it's just...
the problem is that the United States has a commitment to defend all the NATO countries. Greenland is part of NATO. It's Danish territory. We have defended it against the Russians for 70 years. Since NATO came into existence, we've been responsible for its defense. Nothing has changed in that regard. And why suddenly do we have to annex it exactly? Why does it have to become American territory when it is, I mean, the population of the country is Danish, right? Largely. I mean, what is the population? It's 16,000 people? I forget.
Yeah, it's like very small. I mean,
It's very
it's very
small.
small.
Yeah. And by the way, they have an independence party that wants independence, but they want independence. They want self-government. They don't want to be ruled by Denmark or America, is my understanding, right? So how is the United States going to annex it? And what is this? We must have it. We must have it and we need it for security. That's baloney. That's complete nonsense. And people have to recognize, and it makes the United States look like an imperialist country that's trying to exploit its allies. Just like the minerals deal with Ukraine, I saw an analysis piece done on that. I mean, it is unprecedentedly exploitive of Ukraine.
The new draft, yeah. The new draft.
It's incredible. It's like, who would sign this except a country that's being strong-armed from the other side? That I mean, it's
but isn't
it's
the cost?
raw.
I mean,
it's wicked.
Isn't the cost going to be an issue? I mean, if things get really hot in the Arctic and in Eastern Europe and in Asia and the United States is supposed to fix this area, and they're supposed to do this in the area and then protect that area. I mean, the cost would be astronomical, and I think that they probably got briefings. I mean, Trump has not much of a filter, and Vance, I think he needs some proper media training, because I mean, there's a point to be made about the cost, because the United States has significant national debt, and a bigger war, a multi-location war, call it a world war, call it something else. I mean, this is going to cost a lot of money. And
are you suggesting that we can't afford to defend ourselves anymore?
No, it's just like, I think that Trump and Vance, they got a briefing, and the briefing said, this cost needs to be shared, and it would be interesting if this territory was American and that territory was American. But then they go out in public and they say these things without really, without really being diplomatic about it, and just making not they talk about we want it instead of saying we need to figure out a way to defend these territories, and we all this has to be financed somehow. I mean, this would be a much better statement.
It's the same thing. Look, this is coming from the Duganists and Curtis Yarvin. This narrative is calculated to create a split in NATO, and the president is advancing the narrative. The vice president is advancing this narrative. Alexander Dugin is the one that has created this idea of mind warfare, right? And of course, if you go to the Millerman School online, it's millermanschool.com. Discover Dugin's masterpiece, right? And what is his masterpiece? Real wars are downstream from philosophical wars. And I'm arguing that there's this dark enlightenment, Nick Land's book, in which he talks about our hero, Curtis Yarvin, who I believe must be a disciple of Dugin philosophically, because of what he's arguing. And part of what he's arguing is there's only three really major powers in the world: China, Russia, and the United States, and they ought to have their own spheres. And of course, Yarvin has argued that America must let Russia have a free hand in Europe. These are his words. Russia must have a free hand in Europe. That means we let Europe go to Russia. No more NATO. This is what he's suggesting. And of course, the same thing with China in the Far East. Mr. Land, who absolutely adores this guy, I'm told he lives in Shanghai. Okay, Nick Land was a British UK professor who kind of got out of academia. I read that he would actually, in front of his students, spend minutes at a time on the floor writhing like a snake. Very unusual character. But this real wars are downstream from philosophy. Their dark enlightenment is based on these ideas of Dugin's, and Dugin has this idea called pneumachia, which is just another way of saying a war of the mind, war of the intellect, could also be war within the mind, war of minds, war against the mind. It has all these meanings. And it's intended to emphasize the conflict, the combative nature of the structures, the political structures, the military structures, the whole structure of the West, and of course the East. And that you have, and of course, what Dugin wants is multipolarity, which is to break up the East-West, that there's a NATO and that there's a Russia-China communist bloc. He wants to say, oh, no, it's multipolarity. But, of course, it's Eurasianism also.
Yeah. But, I mean, I wanted to...
And this is surprises, conflicts, aporias, struggles, contradictions lie in wait for us. So he wants to create new narratives that are going to cause these contradictions, and this is what we're seeing from this crazy administration out of Vance's mouth.
For American media, like the different papers and television stations, for in the American media, it now seems like, with all the statements from Trump and Vance and others, it seems like, okay, the Republicans are in imperialist mode, and it's like this. It's like the leftist cliche of the conservative world conspiracy, right? So this is like this philosophy, and they're in imperialist mode, but these other places like Europe, they're different, right? They're not in imperialist mode anymore. The Europeans are different, and they've kind of lost that hunger of empire building. But at the same time, I mean, we saw not just the European Union, the European Union, which is which is like the new Rome in the minds of powerful corporations here and in old circles and especially pro-American circles. They came up with this idea of a European Union. It's not all leftist. It's not all just junk and garbage. It's infiltrated. It's no question about that. There's a huge problem in Europe. But there's also like this old school train of thought in Europe that these European countries, they need to band together and structure themselves in order to be a sizable power. And they also had this expansionist idea. This was kind of in the public many years ago. They kind of disappeared from the public. They wanted to expand the European Union into a Mediterranean union. So they wanted to integrate Northern Africa, and like this horseshoe around the Mediterranean. So they also wanted to integrate Syria. That's kind of what the idea was. Israel is supposed to be part of that Mediterranean bloc, and then of course they also had the next idea of further and further integrating Africa. And there's this whole plan of investing serious money in Africa to tie it to, or parts of Africa to tie it to Europe. They have this all planned out. They had this media strategy years ago where they would spend money to have this media campaign in Europe to give a more positive image to Africans. To have more Africans in Europe and to make everybody part of the same thing. So this is just like, these are serious old school ideas, but in a new way. It's not like the Belgium, tiny little Belgium sending thousands of soldiers into the Congo and exploiting it like crazy. This is more like a modern version of, okay, let's expand, and have like this growing structure. And this is when the Russians became a bit nervous. The Russians, they had their own union. They have like this own idea, and they have like this entity, this Russian Union entity with some other countries attached to it, kind of like the old Soviet Union. But of course, there's a clash. Eventually these structures will these two structures will collide with each other, the European/Mediterranean Union and this Russian Union. And there was some high-ranking bureaucrat, and I think the guy was super close to one of the NATO Secretary Generals, because they're all, I mean, NATO is a bit weird as an organization, and I have this in my book. Some very strange people became very high-ranking NATO officials or even Secretary Generals of NATO. And there was this one super important, powerful bureaucrat talking to like this NATO guy, and they said, well, it's like the European Union that we've been creating and we want to expand. That's like reforming the Roman Empire or a version of the Roman Empire without a single shot being fired. You know, this is a quote that's that this is some of the data that we have, that there's still kind of a traditional philosophy, but in a modernized way. It's not all junk in Europe. It's not all just complete garbage. But I think some of the structures, some of these traditional structures in Europe, I think they're very well hidden. I mean, sometimes you see it. I mean, when Volkswagen is having trouble selling its cars, especially electric cars. But now Volkswagen has said they may get into the military production market. I mean,
they are going to make the Leopard. They're going to make the Leopard 2, I understand.
Well, there's Kraus Maffei Wegmann, KMW. There's Rheinmetall. There's Hensoldt. They came up with this passive radar system. It was in the news a couple of years ago. They said we've created a passive radar system that can detect fifth generation stealth fighter planes. So you got all these old, especially German, very old German corporations that are still around, and it's like there's some structures here that are pretty well hidden, and they let the left talk and they let the left do certain things. For example, they let the left praise Africans that come to places like Germany, right? I mean, we actually got African Americans here, you know, because of the military, the U.S. military, and we also get Afro Germans, and they look exactly the same as African Americans, and then we get Afro Germans that look entirely African, but they speak flawless German. Some of the most well integrated people, as long as they don't come from torn up countries, you know, war zones and these crazy places. So it's like these old European structures, they use the left, or they let the left further some bits of agenda, but these old structures, they don't want to have necessarily socialism, but they want this Mediterranean Union. So Europe is a weird place. Europe is very, very complicated, and it's a bit like a double standard It's a bit of a double standard to me when the New York Times is saying, "Oh, look, Vance, look what Trump has said. It's the American conspiracy, the capitalist right-wing world conspiracy, and all these other places are different. Europe is different. Canada is different. Canada, I mean, the real head of state of Canada is the King of Britain, and everybody's sworn into the king as like these old structures are still there. So I'm wondering what type of Canada the U.S. administration is talking to at various points. You know, which version or which part of Canada are they referring to? Or which part of Europe are they referring to? Are they referring to these old structures? You know, when Vance was over here at the Munich Security Conference, you know, Vance had some nice words about the extreme right wing in Europe, as long as they become loyal to America. And Vance was emphasizing that Europe should really focus on conservatism and these internal issues, and not just focus on the Russian threat, which is kind of the same thing, of course, because a lot of destabilization in Europe is because of Russian influence and Chinese influence. But I think Vance knows that, or he's been briefed about that. So it's like a double standard, and I think what Europe are the American administration talking about? Which Canada are they really talking about?
What do you mean, which Canada? There's only one Canada.
Yeah, of course. There's one country that's called Canada and has these borders, but there's like this crazy leftism in Canada. With Trudeau and all this. Canadians, they consider themselves to be so much better than Americans because they're left wing and all that nonsense. But there's also kind of conservative, old conservatives, very very conservative structures in Canada. And Europe is also very paradoxical. There are these.
Well, if Trump had not threatened Canada with annexation and put these high tariffs on them, the conservatives would win the election hands down, because the Liberal Party under Trudeau became so incredibly unpopular. Its policies unpopular. It's just like in the 1970s before Reagan and Thatcher, all this social democracy and all these policies, these regulations, like President at the time. The president before Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, he was putting regulations on, tighten your belt, increasing taxes, wanting to lower the speed limit, saying that we were running out of oil, that we were not going to have enough oil. Reagan gets on in, deregulates, and oil is flowing like crazy. The price of oil falls, right? So it's like these left-leaning policies, both in the U.S. and Europe, were harming our economies. And so people voted. This is why everything moved to the right. You had Kohl in Germany, you had Thatcher in Britain, you had Chirac in France, you had Reagan. You had these people coming to power in the West that were right of center. But the problem, so I think the thing with democracy is you're always having the left emerge, and you're having the left coming through the universities, bringing its people. But they always learn that these policies don't work. Trudeau's Canada doesn't work. He's wrecked the country. So they were going to vote. But Trump's strange policy has estranged Canada, has caused the Liberal Party in Canada to have a revival, and they're probably going to eke out a victory here next month in Canada in the elections. That's all owing to stupidity of the Trump administration, don't you think that, in my opinion.
But don't you think there's at least a possibility? I mean, I'm the last person that is affected by wishful thinking. I mean, I'm always raining on everybody's parade. Been doing that for 20 years. But do you think there's a slight possibility that there's in the West, there's some strategic charade, not the same as the fake split with the communist bloc, but some maybe like staged animosities, and it looks like NATO is falling apart, and the Americans don't like the Canadians and vice versa, and Americans don't like the Europeans and vice versa, and blah blah blah. Don't you think there's a strategic element there of making it seem a certain way so the communist bloc will feel overconfident?
No, I don't, because the communists have such good espionage services. You're dealing with so many different countries. There's no way they could keep some kind of a fake thing from being discovered. You've got communist or Russian and Chinese espionage having penetrated many governments. There's government ministers, cabinet ministers that have been spies. We had, going back to the Roosevelt administration. Look, there's no way that and besides, where would you have a planning body to plan all these countries to engage together in this? Where would this body be? Where they plan this? Who would be the principals?
Well, over the years, I went further back in my own studies, because I was initially hyper focused on the 20th century and learning about all the different countries and their intelligence services, and who was good, who was not good, and who was better, and what operations failed, what operations were a success. But I was curious about the previous era, because if we look at the literature about espionage, it hyper focuses on the 20th century, and we learn that well, the West, the British, the Americans, they supposedly improvised, intelligence services, World War I, World War II, and they started overnight, and it was kind of like a partially an amateurish situation. And when we look at Wiener's book about the CIA, like, it was nothing but failures, with the American intelligence.
Legacy of Ashes.
Yeah, and like, I mean, I read that book. I read many other books, but I thought that judging from European history, I mean, especially the British and some other countries, the French. I mean, when I looked at the 1800s and the 1700s specifically, I got the impression that some of these European empires, some of these Europeans, they were much better at the intelligence game that I had initially assumed, that much better than what the literature would tell us. There's the English edition.
There's
Legacy
Tim
of Ashes.
Weiner's book, Legacy of Ashes, the history
and of
of
course,
the CIA.
if you
it's
read
important to read.
Yeah, it's very important to read. It's also important to learn in this one chapter about John F. Kennedy and his brother, and how much they liked the intelligence world, and they wanted to push back against communism using secret operations. It's like this distorted picture that people have, that they didn't like the intelligence world, and that's why the CIA killed him, blah blah blah, and all that nonsense.
No, that's the claim being made. The CIA, and particularly James Angleton. Supposedly, James Angleton had a 180-page document on Lee Harvey Oswald on his desk when Oswald shot the president. These kind of stories.
Yeah, but also, I mean, this chapter in Wiener's book about the Kennedy era, because he goes through these different eras and talks about the operations and kind of the changes.
The disastrous operations that Weiner
and like the changes in leadership in the CIA, and also, I mean, and it's like, if you read the same source documents that Weiner looked at, of course it seems like a massive failure, bumbling. They had to learn the intelligence game.
Well, it was a massive failure.
It was a massive failure, but I think there were older intelligence structures. Older intelligence structures that go back to the French, different French empires, the different stages of the British Empire. Some German territories were also quite good, I believe, but not as a whole. The Prussians were not good. I mean, the Prussians, which is like Eastern Germany, the Prussians, they were quite capable of domestic intelligence, which is oftentimes easier. You spy on these some of these Enlightenment people and the leftist people, and you infiltrate and you try to steer certain groups and all that. But when it came to foreign intelligence, which is much more difficult, the Prussians were not good. But other large families, with the French empires and the British, various British empire eras, there were some significant structures. And there's new literature. There's like this one book, Spying in the Crown, I think was the title. It's like these two historians that are members of the Royal History Science Organization or whatever. And they actually gave us a bunch of new insight into the past, the 1700s, 1600s, and 1800s. And it's like a piece by piece, I think we're getting a clearer picture that intelligence actually was a thing in the West quite early. I mean, how do you run the French Empire? How do you run the British Empire? How do you run various other empires in Europe, which had a global ambition, with not just the British, and I'm not trying to get into this primitive leftist argument about the colonies, but just from a technical standpoint, if your empire is centered on on the British islands, and you have a global reach, you have this huge navy, you have these different spots in the world where you get your resources from, or you sell stuff back to them, and you have like this global system, and then you form the Bank of England. You actually create the new bond market, and this helped the British greatly to combat the Germans, for example, because the Germans had nothing of the sort. The Germans could not have the Germans could not finance a war with this global system, this balanced system with the bond market and a new central bank and these new merchant banks. So I think intelligence was a bigger thing in Europe, but it's not in the books directly. You can see. I mean, you know various operations that the French were running, or an operation here, and the infiltration of the Enlightenment movement, especially on German soil. I mean, the Bavarian Illuminati were a prime example, because there were all kinds of organizations like the Illuminati, and they claimed to be just standard Enlightenment, but intelligence services kind of used them sometimes, and that became kind of significant. And then we learn about families like the Thon and Taxis family supporting local operations in Bavaria with the Illuminati, but the Thon and Taxis family was tied to these old families that had a big stake in the British Empire. So I think intelligence was a bigger thing, but it's incredibly hard to learn, because it's not really in the books directly. You have to piece it together in this insane puzzle, because Europe is such a chaotic place. Because initially, when I had the suspicion of, okay, you have an empire, French empire in in this era and that era, wouldn't you need a suitable intelligence service, especially a foreign intelligence service and a domestic one? I mean, isn't this kind of a prerequisite for an empire? Didn't the Romans have more intelligence capability than we gave them credit for? And it's often not in literature. I wanted to get, when I was at that point, I want to know. I did what I usually do. I said, I'm going to get the 20 most relevant books to start with. I'm going to get the 20 most relevant books on the subject, and I'll read them all, and then I see what they came up with and what's missing. There were no 20 books on this subject. Older intelligence. There weren't even 10 books. There wasn't even one book directly. And it's like, there's some creepy old structures, very, very old structures in Europe. And I mean, they could pull something off like this. I mean, they have the experience over 1,000 years in some cases. And they're family based. It's aristocracy based, or some darker families, some very creepy families. They have 1,000 plus year history, and they stayed consistent. That's what I noticed the most. Some empires, Portugal at some point was a huge empire, a significant empire. Spain was a significant empire, but they always lost momentum because of internal frictions. But then you had some creepy old families, and they stayed consistent for 1,000 years, and they expanded their operations for over 1,000 years, and I think that was a kind of a family-based core intelligence service, and it's almost impossible to penetrate, other than maybe Lord Louis Mountbatten, who had a communist wife.
These are not nation-state intelligence services. No. They don't have the financing or the numbers. They do not have the capability.
Oh, they had money.
Compete.
They had significant money, and they had government.
Not like a government.
Well, they had government power at some over 1,000 years.
The sophistication of the Russians have exceeded. I mean, any expert historian on intelligence will tell you that the Russians are have been the most sophisticated intelligence operations. Nothing's perfect, but they've been way ahead of everybody else for the last 100 years. And I think it's pretty clear they have. To suggest that there's who's hiding in the closet, who've come out of the Middle Ages with the people that are better, I want to see evidence that it's true and they're still operating. But as far as countering Russian strategy, or preventing them from, infiltrating the U.S. government, the Republican Party, from using organized crime and drug trafficking, as the KGB and GRU have, as according to Joseph D. Douglas Jr.'s work and the testimony of the defector Jan Shena. This is very sophisticated, and this has broken down Western financial structures, has seduced CEOs, and in addition to China doing the same thing, and also just flooding our country with money that they have earned by having our industrial base relocated in China.
Yeah.
And
But
also in Mexico and so on.
they're
So, I
applying
mean,
the
you
method
can't
really well.
say that anyone intelligent, superior in strategy, having
Yeah,
such
but I
a
mean,
capability would
the
have even allowed
Russians,
this to happen.
the Russian intelligence in the communist era, in the supposed post-communist era. I mean, Russian intelligence, for example, I think they've applied the method really well. They've mastered the techniques, and they came up with some new bits, and they were so ferocious at it, and they kind of have a different style. Because it's not like in the West. In the West, intelligence is regarded as a job. There are people that join the CIA, and then after 5 years they get frustrated, or it's like it's not the CIA is not as good as they thought it was, and then they leave and they work for a private company and make more money. It's regarded as a job in the West, but with the Russians, it's you become it's like a privileged position. You join a different section of society, especially in the communist era. We saw this with Putin himself, right? So Putin joined the KGB, he got his training, and then, as far as we know, at first he was deployed, or he was stationed domestically, and then he was allowed foreign posting. And experts have commented on this a lot, and they said that at the time, the domestic part of the KGB, they had too much personnel, and they were chasing down the last few dissidents and just doing these menial tasks. And the real money and the real status and the real privilege came with a foreign posting. Putin always wanted a foreign posting. He was dreaming about West German posting and then taking down Germany and getting revenge on the Germans that besieged Leningrad and all that. So it was like it's almost like a communist warped version or of a intelligence aristocracy. If you were a significant KGB officer, foreign posting, trained the whole bit, you had privilege, but you sold your soul to the KGB. I mean, of course you could reduce your foreign postings. Of course you had certain options within the KGB, but essentially you sold your soul. And they would make the craziest demands. We talked about the sleeper agents. You marry other KGB officer, you have children with this KGB officer, and you live a fake life, so you have credible looking backstory when you live in the West. So there's a difference in philosophies, but in terms of techniques, I mean, there wasn't. I mean, you cannot reinvent the wheel. When the KGB was doing it well, but I don't think they truly invented something groundbreakingly new. And when you talk about the sophistication of the KGB, when it comes to the psychology that these KGB officers use, how they pick their targets, how they work on their targets, how they plan an operation and execute it, has a lot to do with psychology. But who's also a major, if not the major player in psychological research? That's America. They have the.
Well, I don't know. The Russians are pretty sophisticated in psychology, and the Americans don't tend to use it. The problem is in the management and the strategy management. Look, you can see with Dugin, who is according to Heiser, is a recruited KGB agent or possibly officer. He's clearly working a large network for the Russian Federation, trying to recruit people on the right, traditionalists. So Dugin is a subverter of the right in the third world, in Europe, in South America, in the United States even. And if you go to the Millerman School, and this idea of pneumachia, that real wars are downstream from philosophical wars, there's a deep truth in this. And so the field of thinking is the field of warfare. This is the idea that the Russians have. And the Chinese have this idea too, and that thoughts wage ceaseless war against other types of thoughts. And the complexity and the diversity of the vertical and horizontal, they call it, noetic and noeric chains of logical interpretation and narrative allows them to understand this, allows them these narrative manipulations. And I talked to a very intelligent analyst of Russia's activities in Africa last week, and she was telling me that, you're right about the scissor strategy. I see it all over Africa. They're taking over Africa, the Russians are, and of course the Chinese are taking over other parts of Africa. I think they have a division of labor there. And so the wars between people, including the most cruel and bloody wars, like the war in Ukraine, are nothing compared to the philosophical war, the mind war that precedes it. So you look at Putin's, what really is amazing, and the perfect example of this is these Trump people and MAGA movement, when you're looking at their narrative about the war in Ukraine. I just went through Putin's speech and his statements in Murmansk when he went up there to see the submarine sailors. It was like 5 or 6 lies. Ukraine is Nazi. There was a genocide in eastern Ukraine. There was a coup in 2014. Russia has been very patient, blah, blah, blah. It's aggression from NATO. All of these themes are repeated by the major MAGA podcasters and now by the vice president and the president. These things are coming out of their mouth. They are influenced by this mind war. Their minds have been colonized.
But
shall we say, by Dugin. In fact, one former student of Dugin told me, Dugin is the real president of the United States.
Yeah, but I think Dugin has not really progressed that much from his. What
do you mean?
From his mentors, the people he learned from, or the
Golovin circle.
Well, no, if you construe an argument and you say, because this is kind of like one of the most popular views or manipulated views on this, it goes like this: the Jewish world conspiracy. Jewish world conspiracy controls the United States, and they also this Jewish conspiracy wanted to take over Ukraine and turn it into this leftist, gay hellhole. And
but
Putin,
Ukraine is also Nazi. Remember?
Yeah. But with this particular argument that this Jewish conspiracy was taking over Ukraine, and Putin is supposedly saving Ukraine.
That
from
by
the
the way,
conspiracy.
Dugin does not directly acknowledge that argument, but he has mentored people who have then gone out and won over the neo-Nazi right, won over the alt-right to this argument. But Dugin is like one step removed in the back, because Dugin is also animating those people who have different arguments, people in the third world.
There's versions of it. Of course, there's versions of it. I mean, recently, in maybe the last 2 years, I saw more Russian propaganda, which is attacking the history of the British Empire. So they try to pin everything on the British Empire.
Well, yeah, because they're attacking, remember, from Curtis Yarvin to Dugin's other disciples, always it's the liberal Anglo-Saxon tradition and Protestantism that is the enemy, and that's why they've been trying to recruit among Catholics.
Yeah, and when certain influencers, when they talk trash about the British Empire, a lot of people in the audience are gonna think, well, but the Jewish conspiracy took over Britain, so that's like just code speak. We don't say Jewish conspiracy, but we mean Jewish conspiracy when we talk about the British Empire because of these Rothschild, stories, fairy tales. So it's like there's variations of it, but a lot of what Dugin is doing is not too different from this 100-plus-year-old stuff from Gustave Le Bon when he talked about the psychology of the masses, how stupid the masses can be, individuals in a group setting, how stupid they are, how easily they can be led, and how they are irrational, and they want a crazy leader. They want this crazy or semi-crazy leader. They want to
dream
be led.
Fulfillment. They want their wishes.
They want to be led.
They
want to be led by a guy like that, and they want irrational thought. They want to share irrational ideas because that's how they believe they can transcend the boundaries of physics and the boundaries of logic. Logic doesn't apply to them. It's like magic, right? And when you talk about let's say Africans, we saw this whole KGB ledger of trying to antagonize Africans against Europe and the West. We saw the same techniques being used on African Americans. This whole liberation theology: the white man is the devil, blah blah blah, and you need to fight the white man. But at the core, these techniques are still very, very baseline, I think, and very, very old. I mean, I don't think Dugin has progressed that much, and he's aided by...
Oh no, it's very sophisticated what he's doing.
Well, he's
and
aided by
I've had the testimony of people...
They've got
hundreds of Telegram channels, hundreds and hundreds of Telegram channels educating Africans and South Americans, Asians in this Eurasianism and the perennialism that draws them, that teaches them that there's an esoteric truth underlying all the different religions. So in a way, all these various right-wing groups can be united and they can actually become compatible with Marxism, Leninism, and the anti-Atlanticist, anti-Western, kill the golden billion philosophy of Dugin, and of course his Russian bosses, who want to be able to they can't bring about victory over the world by just controlling the left. The left is too weak. They've realized they have to bring in the religious people. They have to bring in the right, and they have to control them both in a scissors strategy in order to take over the world, in order to not have the maximum resistance to what they want to do. And they're succeeding at it. It's very sophisticated.
Yeah, but it's aided by databases. I mean, when the Russians know about people in the West, who's intelligent, who is below average, who's above average, who is susceptible to what kind of message. I mean, of course, it has to be aided by a sophisticated system of data collection, data processing, and then fleshing it out. But the core strategy is still the same old. We just appeal to people's emotions and past transgressions. And it's like, there's studies in the West about the stages of radicalization, for example. This was terrorism studies, and they figured out a better way of understanding how somebody can become a terrorist. And it's like the same old stuff. You isolate somebody from differing opinions, you isolate somebody from anybody outside the group, and you just morph these people and you get them to do things. It's like, I saw this, when COVID happened, right? When COVID happened in Germany, we have an old population. There's so many millions and millions of people who are older than 60 and who have heart problems already and who are in danger of COVID. But then these influencers, we already knew these influencers. They've always been pro-Russian. They've always been, tight with the Dugin circles. And these influencers, they started to talk about COVID, and they were antagonizing people more and more and more. And that this is when the security services of various countries started to push back against this, when they figured that, okay, it's the Russians, they're trying to make the COVID problem worse for us. They say that it's not a problem really, even though we have all these old people in Germany who are vulnerable. And it's like this antagonizing and incentivizing people to go to do illegal things, just fake vaccine certificate that you were supposedly vaccinated, or selling these blank vaccine documents, and on. They incentivized people to do something illegal, and when they got caught, these German citizens got caught, they became even more hateful of the system, and they were hoping even more that Putin would save them. And this kind of bled into these weirdo groups, weirdo right-wing groups, and they have Russian connections. There was a terrorism case of a group that had access to the German parliament, and they had weapons, they had money, they had Russian connections. And these weirdo groups, they always, I'm telling you, they always have a back channel to Russia, and they always deliver sealed envelopes with a message for the Russian administration. They have meetings, in Russian embassies, but they also have these back channels to hand deliver certain written messages. And it's like okay, this is how it works. This is how they do the stage by stage program to get people so mad they can see a future in the system, or they don't want to improve a system, they don't want to change the system, they just want to destroy it. And they want to adopt the Russian systems. They want to invite Putin, have him in Berlin, raise the Russian flag, and then have like these little German sub-dictators or little puppet sub-dictators pretending to run specific areas of Germany. And that's how the Dugin people play it. But mostly it's for a big target audience, it always goes back to, well, the elders of Zion, the Jewish conspiracy is doing this, and this is why we have to do that. The Jewish conspiracy wanted to take over Ukraine. That's why we have to help Putin. We need to help Putin liberate Ukraine from the Jewish conspiracy. It always goes back to these little things. And these simple techniques are aided by psychology. They're aided by databasing. They're aided by stealing our data and how we are and the individual, how smart he is, how dumb he is. Does this person read? Has this person bought any real books in the last 10 years? Or is this person entirely on the internet? How much garbage has this person, this German, for example, liked on the web, on Telegram? Is he buying everything we're telling him? Is he believing everything? Does he have money trouble? Does he have marital troubles? Is he angry enough? Is he ready to torch the German system? That kind of thing. I mean, the Russians are ferocious, but it's not like they invented completely new intelligence techniques. They're just doing them well. You're muted.
I think they have invented some new ones, and I think they've perfected some old ones. They've taken controlled opposition and they've exported it to democracy. You see, you never had these democratic countries before, so-called democratic, these mixed systems where you had different political parties in all these different countries, and then you could come in and you could play a game where you infiltrated agents on both sides, that you would create political movements and narratives completely, because we've never lived in an information age before. Yeah. The possibilities with the internet, the internet in the digital realm is completely new, and they've proven that they've gained mastery on it. I think that they've gotten high degree of control in Microsoft and Google, and that they are manipulating, for example, I think our searches on Google, for example, are manipulated. What comes up on a search? Certain things I notice, things that I'm interested in investigating and research. 25 years ago, I could find them right away and I could go there. Today, if I do those same searches, I can't come up with anything. It's like it's gone.
Oh, yeah.
And the search engine's not working the same way. I saw that evolve. That's not an accident. And people who do what I do, we notice these things. Our tools are taken away. We're blocked. You have ghosting. You have when I was originally with Twitter, I got up to about 5,000 people. And even if I'd get on a radio show with 1 million listeners, my numbers wouldn't increase on Twitter of people, for years, for like 10 years. And then, you have it become X, and it's taken over by of course,
Elon,
our famous billionaire, Elon Musk. And suddenly my numbers bump up again, but still not that much. It's like something happened. I was allowed to go up to a certain ceiling, but now he's dangerous. Keep him down there. I don't know. I know that narratives are controlled and manipulated, and I think we would be naive to think that the communist services, no, you can't tell me this was in Sun Tzu's time. They didn't have smartphones. They didn't have all this digital media. This is new. They've invented and creatively brought about new forms of this mind war.
Yeah.
Dugin's talking about. Dugin has a level of philosophic sophistication. There's no doubt about it.
But in Europe, for example, when call it modern conspiracy media became a thing. This was after the French Revolution, and suddenly you had these best-selling books, and they became instantly famous. English language, German, French, and influenced the next generation of authors, of course. When that happened, when I studied these books, which were a mass phenomenon, they were written in such a pleasant style, very easy to read, almost contemporary. It was almost like you could read this today, almost to some degree. I expected a different style. I expected a different tone, but it was almost perfectly shaped for a target audience. And then when we go when in later times, when the internet was still not around, there was no internet whatsoever. And I studied that conspiracy literature, even pamphlets, short pamphlets, like a short YouTube video or a TikTok video. It's not just books. It was also VHS tapes. It was pamphlets, very short booklets. And when you have a booklet like this and you read it, it's a very focused style, very slickly done. And then at the end of this thing, it suggests to you 10 to 20 additional things that you could get, that you could buy. It's almost like the video suggestions on YouTube, before YouTube, was sanitized, from all the crazy stuff years ago. You would click on some crazy conspiracy video, a fascist crazy video, and then you would get suggestions of more stuff to watch. And the more you clicked on them, the more suggestions you got, and it became worse and worse and worse. So you start out with a video. This is what many people actually experienced. People who had no prior contact to conspiracy content, they clicked on a video during the banking crisis of, I think, 2008. Right? So people lost money, the economy was in shambles, the euro, our currency, had to be saved by questionable measures. So people got interested in this stuff. So they go online, and there's a video that seems kind of legit. It's not overtly fascist, and it talks about, well, the banks and the central bank and blah 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 blah, and then they introduce the Rothschild mythology, and then they get you to the point where you click on the next thing and the next thing, and finally you will end up with the real stuff, the explicit stuff. And so I saw the same kind of structure even before the internet, with these pamphlets and these books suggesting you the next stuff that you could buy at a cheap price, and you can mail order them. It was the same with YouTube for a while, and other platforms for a while. So even before the internet, you had viral content, and even way before that, you had pamphlets, communist pamphlets in Europe, because they were easy to print, they were cheap to print. They had all these illegal little printing presses hidden somewhere in somebody's basement, and they would print out these communist pamphlets and then pass them around. And the German secret police would try to find these printing presses. The Prussians were trying to find them. The phenomenon has gotten so much worse, but I think it's been there before, but not in that magnitude, and not with learning algorithms. Because if you mail order something, you order some revisionist, denial book, right? And then you say, I'm gonna order 2 more of these, and then you're on somebody's list. You are on the customer list of a tiny little publishing house, or maybe a slightly larger publishing house. They have your name on file, and this is something that intelligence agencies were interested in, to find these membership lists. But if you're on the internet, if you're on Telegram or the old YouTube and whatever, you click on something and there's a digital record. You clicked on it, you liked it, you shared it around, you watched the whole thing, and then you watched another thing, and then you watched another thing. And this creates a profile, even a psychological profile of who you are. And the Dugin people, I think the Dugin people, they had the benefit of an increase of Russian activity in the conspiracy movement. It's not a niche anymore. It's like a huge mass phenomenon. It's been a mass phenomenon before in Europe, for example, but now it's an even bigger phenomenon when they give you an explanation like the Jews try to take over Ukraine and Putin is saving Ukraine from the Jews. Meanwhile, and I explain this to people, I mean,
no, he's saving them from the Nazis, not the Jews.
But even the Rothschild, even the old Rothschild bank, they were approached, in years ago. They were approached by Russians, and they said, "You need to find. We want you to find us new money, new investor money for."
Well, one of the Rothschilds, after his death, they found he was a KGB agent.
Victor.
I don't remember his first name. He died decades ago now, but it was in the newspapers here in the U.S.
It's it was this controversy about Victor Rothschild. He was possibly another member of the Cambridge Five. But this, the Rothschild Bank, they were supposed to find new money for an aluminum company in Russia. And this is not an isolated incident. So it's like, it's just like the Russians, they try to take advantage of Western banks, and also the Russians, to a degree, they have copied Western banks. I mean, look at Sberbank, look at Vneshkonom and all these other money, these supposed merchant banks in Russia. They're majority owned by the government, and even if they're not officially majority owned by the government, they're owned by people who are part of the government or who are part of the government structure. So you have a Russian central bank.
It was here it was Victor Rothschild. Yeah, this is from the Independent, and I'm just looking at the headline. It's from 22 October 1994. The late Lord Rothschild, scientist, think tank head, first-class cricketer, bomb disposal expert, and MI5 agent, was a super spy for the Russians, according to a forthcoming book. The Fifth Man, by Australian author Roland Perry, claims to prove that Victor Rothschild stole all major UK-US weapons developments in the Second World War, including biological warfare, the atomic bomb, and radar. This is he supposedly worked with Klaus Fuchs, and of course that ends up implicating again in the spycatcher scandal. It ends up, of course, as you know, pointing back to the head of MI5, Sir Roger Hollis, who was accused by his deputy of being a longtime Soviet agent.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the bungling, or as it was described later on, like the Klaus Fuchs atomic spy mega scandal and the Cambridge Five, of course, and others.
So see, people who would say there's a Jewish conspiracy in the Rothschilds, but are part. No, it's a KGB thing.
Well, I mean,
and
the
KGB
Rosenbergs
infiltrates everybody.
Yeah. I mean, the Rosenbergs. I mean, the Rosenbergs were also atomic spies. I mean, they were smart people, but they were specializing in engineering and design. They were not knowledgeable about politics and empires and espionage. So somehow they got lured into this espionage. It was the usual KGB sales pitch to Jewish people. The West was fascist, and the West didn't really want to stop Hitler early enough, and it was the Soviet Union, it was communism that finally stopped Hitler. And the communists made the greatest sacrifice, blah, blah, blah. And so the Rosenbergs, I mean, I think they were approached when they got caught. You have to tell us everything. You have to publicly apologize, and then you get spared the death penalty. But I think they chose the death penalty because somehow even people with a high IQ, they got sucked into this. And, this was kind of the standard pitch, because there's always a tailored pitch to all these target audiences. And the British, I mean, all this bungling, with the Cambridge Five, when McLean and Karen Cross and all these guys, when they got caught one after the other, initially the response at Whitehall was, where some of the responses was, that's surprising because we thought these were like people from Anglo circles, old families.
Well, Kim Philby was slated to become the future head of
Yep.
MI6.
So that was kind of a big surprise. With some of these spies that were caught, these Whitehall people said, "Oh well, that was a Jewish guy. He didn't really consider himself to be Anglo and British, so it's no surprise there." But then these true Anglo-British guys got caught from these older families, and that was a big surprise in Whitehall, even though it shouldn't have been a surprise. And when Klaus Fuchs was exposed, there was this review in British intelligence circles. They try to figure out how did we mess up so bad, because we promised the Americans that this guy was safe, and then we told them this wasn't true. We sent him to the Manhattan Project to make the A-bomb, but we made some promises, and we couldn't actually deliver on these promises. And then there was a review, and they said, well, there were 5-6 instances where this Klaus Fuchs guy should have been caught. He had like this communist brother or sister, and this whole backstory. He was in communist scientific circles in Britain, and like what? And one spy actually infiltrated a circle, and the spy, he was relating information about what he had documented, and somehow this information wasn't passed on the right way, blah, blah, blah. And so this was another missed opportunity to catch Klaus Fuchs. And of course, experts then assumed there may have been another mole or a high-ranking mole that we don't know yet who protected Klaus Fuchs. And so we see all this history of bungling. And it's not like the British were incapable. The British were incapable of intelligence operations. But if it's the head of the head of MI5, or if it's somebody high up in MI6, or if it's maybe a Lord Louis Mountbatten, that's when you get a real problem. That's when you get like this impression of bungling and amateur hour, compared to the Soviets. Because, the British had, before these scandals, the British had a pretty good reputation because of the British successes against the Nazis. Because the Nazis, they made, they wanted to make Reinhard Heydrich to make an intelligence head out of Reinhard Heydrich. And they somehow misread his qualifications. He was like was it Heydrich or the other guy? He was like a radio guy, not an intelligence guy, but somebody misread the job description.
Well, Heydrich was a naval officer who was disgraced, and he was sort of a protege of Admiral Canaris, who became the head of the Abwehr. And so Canaris was a famous World War I spy, and it was a naval officer. But anyway, we've gotten a little far afield from our news, but I think we've covered everything. We've covered everything.
I don't think I don't think we ever really stray away from the topic, because we also have to talk about the techniques and the history of the techniques, and who is good at what. People are obsessed with who's the better sports player, what team is better, and in what metric is this player better than the other player, and this team better than the other team. And I think this should also apply to the intelligence world. Who is good at this, who has successes, and who needs to shape up, essentially.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I want to thank the listeners for bearing with us. This has been Friends and Enemies. We've been discussing the latest developments in American strategy and diplomacy, foreign policy, and again, the importance of espionage within all of this. And my co-host has been Alex Benesch. I'm Jeff Nyquist, and thanks for joining us.